76 Japanese women sat in an Arizona prison camp, scissors hidden in their clothes, sharpened and ready. They knew what happened to prisoners who fell into American hands. The propaganda films had shown them torture, violation, death. These nurses and telephone operators from Saipan had seen too much to believe in mercy. But on December 23, 1944, trucks arrived at the compound. The women prepared for the worst. Instead, American women stepped out carrying wrapped presents, red and green packages, Christmas gifts. One young Japanese nurse opened the first box with trembling hands. Inside, chocolate, hand-knitted socks, and a Christmas card from an American family with 5 words that shattered everything she believed. "We pray for your safety." The card was signed by the Henderson family. Their son was somewhere in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. Yet they had sent gifts to enemy prisoners. The nurse collapsed sobbing, not from fear or sadness, but from something that broke her more than any interrogation could. These Americans, whose sons and brothers had died at Pearl Harbor, at Bataan, were giving Christmas presents to their enemies. What these women discovered that Christmas would haunt them for the rest of their lives, because learning your enemy is human, changes everything about who you thought you were, and makes going home to a nation built on hate the cruelest gift of all. The Arizona desert in December 1944 was a place of contradictions. While snow fell on the distant peaks of the Santa Catalina Mountains, the valley floor around Camp Florence remained dry and dusty, its temperatures swinging from near-freezing nights to warm afternoons that could trick you into forgetting it was winter. This former Army training ground, 30 miles southeast of Phoenix, had been hastily converted into something the American military hadn't quite planned for: a detention facility for Japanese women. They were an afterthought of war, these 76 women. When American forces took Saipan in July 1944, military planners had prepared for Japanese soldiers who would fight to the death, following the Bushido code that made surrender unthinkable. They hadn't prepared for the women found in the aftermath: military nurses who'd tended the Japanese wounded, telephone operators who'd worked in communications bunkers, and most problematically, the comfort women discovered in facilities that no one wanted to officially acknowledge. The decision to bring them to American soil was controversial and classified. The alternative, leaving them in the Pacific Theater, posed security risks and humanitarian concerns that conflicted with each other. So they were quietly shipped across the Pacific, then transported by train across the American continent to this remote corner of Arizona, where their existence could be kept from public attention while authorities figured out what to do with them. Michiko Tanaka had been counting days since capture. 153 days since the Americans had found her in a cave on Saipan, still wearing her blood-stained nurse's uniform, still clutching medical supplies for soldiers who would never need them. At 23, she'd already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. She'd held the hands of dying 18-year-old boys who called for their mothers. She'd amputated limbs without anesthesia when supplies ran out. She'd heard the propaganda broadcasts telling civilians to throw themselves from the cliffs rather than face American capture. She'd believed those broadcasts. They all had. The American devils, they were told, would torture the men and violate the women. Better to die with honor than live with shame. Michiko had kept a scalpel hidden in her uniform, sharpened to a razor's edge. Not for defense, she knew that was useless, but for seppuku, ritual suicide, when the moment came. Yet the moment never came. The Americans who found her cave spoke through a Japanese-American translator, promised medical care for the wounded, promised food and safety. Michiko had expected it to be a trap, even when they kept their promises. She remained convinced the real horror was being saved for later. The ship to Hawaii, the train across America. Surely these were just stages before the true punishment began. Camp Florence seemed to confirm her fears. Barbed wires surrounded the compound. Guard towers stood at each corner. Armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter. The barracks were sparse. wooden buildings that leaked dust through every crack, with beds that were little more than cots with thin mattresses. This was clearly a prison, and prisoners in war received what they deserved. The other women shared her expectations. Yuki Sato, only 19, had worked as a telephone operator at the Japanese naval installation on Saipan. She'd been taught English in school, a skill that now terrified her. Would the Americans use her as a translator to interrogate others? Would they force her to betray secrets she didn't even possess? Haruko Nakamura carried different fears. At 21, she'd already endured 2 years as a comfort woman, shipped from Korea to serve the Imperial Army. The Americans had found her in a concrete bunker with 12 other women, some barely conscious, all wishing they'd had the courage to join the thousands who jumped from Banzai Cliff. Haruko didn't fear death. She feared continuing to live in the ways she'd been forced to live. The first weeks at Camp Florence had been a careful dance of mutual suspicion. The American guards kept their distance, speaking only when necessary. The women prisoners maintained strict solidarity, sharing nothing beyond name and rank when questioned. Meals were adequate: rice, vegetables, occasional meat. But many women ate sparingly, still expecting poison. Sleep came fitfully, every woman ready to wake at the sound of boots approaching their barracks. Captain Ruth Morrison observed this standoff with professional concern. A career Army nurse before joining the Women's Army Corps, she'd been assigned command of the female prisoners section with minimal guidance. The Army's manual for prisoner management assumed male soldiers, not civilian women. The Geneva Convention provided rules that seemed almost quaint, given the reality of Pacific warfare. Morrison had to improvise, relying on instinct and common sense. She noticed things the male commanders missed: how the women flinched at sudden movements, how they watched the guards with eyes that expected violence, how they maintained their own strict hierarchy, with the nurses tending to the comfort women despite the social gulf that would have separated them in Japan. These weren't hardened soldiers, but traumatized civilians caught in war's machinery. Morrison's reports to her superiors requested basic amenities: sewing supplies for clothing repair, books in Japanese, materials for traditional crafts. The requests were denied as unnecessary comfort for enemies. But Morrison persisted, arguing that occupied women were less likely to attempt suicide or escape. That pragmatic argument succeeded where humanitarian ones had failed. By December, a routine had emerged. The women worked in the camp laundry, kitchen, and garden. They were allowed to gather in the evenings, sharing stories and songs from home. A few had begun learning English from the Nisei translators. The atmosphere remained tense, but stable. Then came December 20th, when Morrison received an unusual request from a group of Phoenix church women. They'd learned through Red Cross channels that Japanese women were being held at Camp Florence. With Christmas approaching, they wanted to send gifts. Morrison's first instinct was to refuse. These prisoners were enemies whose nation had attacked Pearl Harbor, tortured American prisoners, committed atrocities across the Pacific. Many of the churchwomen had lost sons, brothers, husbands in the war. Why would they want to give gifts to the enemy? The answer came from Dorothy Williams, a 58-year-old widow who led the church group. Her son David had died at Pearl Harbor, one of the 177 sailors who went down with the USS Arizona. Yet here she stood in Morrison's office, holding a wrapped package, explaining that Christmas meant showing love to all, especially enemies. "Captain," Dorothy had said, "I could spend my life hating every Japanese person for what happened to David. But what would that accomplish? Would it bring him back? Would it honor his memory? He died fighting against hatred and tyranny. The least I can do is refuse to let hatred win in my own heart." Morrison struggled with the decision. Military regulations neither forbade nor encouraged such contact. Security concerns argued against it. What if the prisoners saw it as mockery or propaganda? What if they reacted violently? But something in Dorothy's quiet determination, her transformation of grief into grace, made Morrison agree to a trial. A small gift distribution, carefully controlled to gauge the reaction. She had no idea she was about to authorize an event that would shatter worldviews, challenge everything these women believed about their enemies, and plant seeds of humanity that would bloom across decades. The wrapped packages sitting in Morrison's office looked innocent enough, simple Christmas gifts from churchwomen to prisoners of war. But they were about to become something else entirely. Proof that even in war's hatred, love could find a way to surprise, to subvert, to survive. December 23rd dawned cold and clear over Camp Florence. Frost clung to the barbed wire, transforming the threatening barrier into something almost beautiful in the morning sun. Inside Barracks 3, Michiko Tanaka woke to excited whispers. Something was happening. Guards had been seen carrying boxes into the administration building. Kitchen workers reported American women arriving in automobiles, dressed not in military uniforms, but in civilian clothes. Church clothes, someone said. The speculation ran wild. Interrogation specialists, some guessed. Government officials coming to announce transfers to worse facilities. Perhaps they would be sent to work in factories, or mines, or worse. Yuki Sato suggested they might be Red Cross inspectors, but others dismissed this. Why would the Red Cross care about Japanese prisoners when Japan itself had withdrawn from the Geneva Convention protocols? At 10 o'clock, the women were ordered to assembly. Not the usual morning count, but a special gathering in the mess hall. They filed in silently, taking their assigned seats, backs straight, eyes forward. Military discipline, even in captivity, provided structure against chaos. Captain Morrison entered, accompanied by 3 American women and Mary Yamamoto, the Nisei translator whose presence always signaled important announcements. But behind them came something unexpected. Soldiers carrying boxes. Not military crates or supply containers, but packages wrapped in bright paper. Red and green, gold ribbons, the colors of the American Christmas the prisoners had been trying to ignore. Morrison spoke first, her words translated by Mary with careful precision. These packages are Christmas gifts for you, sent by families from churches in Phoenix. They wanted you to know that even though our nations are at war, the spirit of Christmas recognizes no enemies. The silence that followed was absolute, not the respectful quiet of military discipline, but the frozen stillness of minds unable to process what they'd heard. Gifts for them, from American civilians? Dorothy Williams stepped forward. Through Mary's translation, she explained that 23 families had contributed. Each package had been prepared with care, containing items they thought the women might need or enjoy. This wasn't government propaganda or military strategy. This was personal. Individual American families had chosen to give presents to individual Japanese prisoners. She began calling names from a list. Tanaka Michiko. Michiko stood mechanically, her legs moving without conscious thought. She approached the table where Dorothy held out a package. The older American woman smiled, not the false smile of propaganda photos, but something genuine and slightly sad. Michiko took the package with both hands, bowing from instinct, then returned to her seat. One by one, names were called. Each woman received a package. Some were larger, some smaller, all wrapped with obvious care. The American Church. Women watched with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They debated this gesture for weeks. Some congregation members had strongly opposed it. How could they give gifts to the enemy while American boys were still dying in the Pacific? But Dorothy had prevailed with a simple argument. If we become like our enemies in our hatred, haven't they already won? If we abandon Christian charity because of war, what exactly are our boys fighting to preserve? When all 76 packages had been distributed, the women sat frozen, gifts untouched on the tables before them. Morrison, reading the room with a nurse's intuition, made a decision. You may open them now if you wish, or take them to your barracks. There are no obligations, no expectations of thanks. These are freely given. It was Haruko Nakamura who moved first. The former comfort woman, who'd learned to expect nothing but cruelty from strangers, slowly pulled at the ribbon on her package. The paper fell away to reveal a box. Inside, a bar of lavender soap, still wrapped in delicate paper. A pair of thick wool socks, hand-knitted in blue and white. A chocolate bar. A small hand mirror in a decorated wooden frame. And at the bottom, a Christmas card. She opened the card with trembling fingers. Mary Yamamoto, watching from the front, translated aloud. "May you find peace and comfort this Christmas season. You are far from home, but not forgotten. The Mitchell family." Haruko's composure, maintained through years of unspeakable treatment, finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the wool socks. Such a simple thing. Socks knitted by a stranger's hands, given freely to an enemy. In her world, comfort women received nothing freely. Everything had a price, usually paid in dignity and pain. But these socks asked nothing of her. They were simply given. The emotional dam burst throughout the room. Women opened packages to find treasures mundane and precious. Hairbrushes, writing paper, hard candies, handkerchiefs embroidered with flowers, small tins of tea, ribbons for their hair. Each gift had been chosen thoughtfully. The church women had asked the Nisei community what Japanese women might appreciate, trying to balance American Christmas traditions with cultural sensitivity. Michiko's package contained something that stopped her breath, a small sewing kit with quality needles and thread. In the camp, they'd been mending clothes with rough thread and bent needles. This kit was professional quality, the kind her mother had used in their Yokohama shop before the war. Attached was a note. "My grandmother was a seamstress. She taught me that needle and thread can repair more than cloth. They can mend hearts. I hope these help you keep your clothes and spirits whole." It was signed Betty Morrison, with a postscript. "My husband is somewhere in the Pacific. I pray for his safety and yours." The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These American women had husbands, sons, brothers, fighting Japanese forces. Some had already lost loved ones. The gold star pins several wore indicated they were mothers of fallen soldiers. Yet they'd spent money, time, and effort creating gifts for Japanese prisoners. Yuki Sato found herself holding a diary, blank pages bound in leather, with a pen tucked into the binding. The card read, "Everyone deserves to record their thoughts and hopes. Your story matters." She looked up to see one of the American women watching her, a young woman not much older than herself, wearing a gold star pin. Their eyes met across the cultural chasm. The American woman nodded slightly, a recognition between two young women caught in old men's wars. Captain Morrison watched the scene with professional assessment and personal emotion. She'd commanded nurses through the Depression, trained women for war, seen humanity at its worst. But watching enemies exchange kindness in a mess hall in Arizona, she felt something shift. These weren't grand peace negotiations or diplomatic breakthroughs. These were small gestures, soap and socks, chocolate and Christmas cards. Yet they were creating cracks in walls built by years of propaganda and hatred. Not everyone accepted the gifts easily. Several older women, particularly those who'd lost sons in the war, sat with unopened packages. They'd been taught that accepting gifts created obligation, that kindness from enemies was deception. But as they watched others crying over hand-knitted scarves and simple Christmas cards, their resistance wavered. One elderly nurse, Matsui-san, had maintained strict military bearing throughout imprisonment. She'd forbidden the younger women from fraternizing with guards, from learning English, from anything that suggested acceptance of their situation. But when she opened her package to find medicine for arthritis, medicine the camp hospital had been unable to provide, her facade cracked. The American woman who'd sent it had included a note. "My mother suffered from arthritis. I know the pain. Enemy or not, no one should suffer needlessly." The church women had planned to leave after the distribution, but Dorothy Williams made a spontaneous decision. Through Mary Yamamoto, she asked if she could explain why they'd brought gifts. Morrison approved, curious herself about the motivation. Dorothy stood before the assembled prisoners, her weathered hands clasped, her voice steady but emotional. 3 years ago, my son David died at Pearl Harbor. I wanted to hate every Japanese person forever, but hatred was eating me alive, making me into someone David wouldn't recognize. Then I remembered what he wrote in his last letter home. Mom, if anything happens to me, don't let it make you bitter. The world needs more love, not more hate. So I chose love, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. You didn't kill my son, your daughters and sisters, far from home, caught in something bigger than all of us. If giving you Christmas gifts helps even one person believe in kindness again, then David's death meant something. The translation finished in silence. Then, from the back of the room, Michiko stood and spoke in halting English. Thank you. We not understand. But thank you. It was inadequate, everyone knew. How could words bridge such divides? But it was a beginning. The days following Christmas 1944 at Camp Florence moved in a strange, suspended reality. The gifts remained visible everywhere. Women wearing new socks despite the relative warmth, carefully rationing chocolate squares to make them last, writing tentatively in new diaries. But more than physical objects had entered the camp. Questions had arrived with those packages. Questions that no amount of military discipline could silence. In Barracks 3, late-night discussions replaced the usual silence. Michiko Tanaka had become an unofficial interpreter of this American kindness, her better English making her a bridge between confusion and comprehension. The younger women gathered around her bunk, seeking explanations for the inexplicable. Tanaka-san, Yuki whispered one night, the woman who gave me the diary. She wore the gold star. Her son is dead from this war. Why would she give gifts to us? Michiko had no answer that made sense within their framework. In Japan, families of war dead became living shrines to hatred of the enemy. They were expected to channel grief into support for greater military effort, more sacrifice, total victory. The idea of a Gold Star mother giving presents to enemy prisoners violated every social expectation they knew. The comfort women faced an even deeper psychological crisis. Haruko Nakamura had hidden her wool socks under her mattress, taking them out at night to touch them, to verify they were real. For 2 years, she'd received nothing without payment, extracted in humiliation. Every comfort station meal, every piece of clothing, every medical treatment had been recorded as debt against future service. Now she possessed something given freely, and she literally didn't know how to process it. They want something, insisted Kimura-san, one of the older comfort women. No one gives without taking, especially not to us. But days passed, then weeks, and no payment was demanded. No American soldier arrived to collect on the kindness. The gifts remained free, and that freedom was more destabilizing than any interrogation could have been. Captain Morrison observed these changes with careful documentation. Her January 1945 report noted, "The Christmas Gift Initiative has created unexpected psychological effects. Prisoners who maintained hostile silence now initiate conversation. Suicide watch incidents have decreased to 0. Most significantly, the prisoners have begun reciprocating with small gestures, origami figures left for guards, drawings given to kitchen staff, extraordinary cooperation with camp routines." What Morrison didn't document, perhaps couldn't articulate, was the deeper transformation. These women were experiencing something psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance, the mental stress of holding contradictory beliefs. Everything they'd been taught about Americans conflicted with the evidence before them. The response to such dissonance was either to reject the new information or reconstruct their entire worldview. Slowly, worldview reconstruction was winning. The change became visible during a medical emergency in late January. Private Johnson, one of the younger guards, collapsed during his shift with acute appendicitis. As medics rushed to transport him, several Japanese nurses stepped forward, offering assistance. Michiko, using her improving English, quickly communicated Johnson's symptoms to the camp doctor, potentially saving crucial minutes. When Johnson recovered, he learned that the enemy prisoners had helped save his life. The story spread through both guard and prisoner populations, adding another crack to the wall between them. February brought an unexpected development. The Phoenix Church women requested permission for a return visit. They wanted to know if the gifts had been appreciated, if other items were needed. Morrison hesitated. The first gift exchange had been successful, but repeated contact risked complications. What if prisoners became dependent? What if emotional attachments formed that would make eventual repatriation harder? Dorothy Williams addressed these concerns directly. "Captain, dependence already exists. We depend on hatred to make war acceptable. If we can become dependent on kindness instead, isn't that healthier? As for attachments, I've already lost my son. I'm not afraid of losing anything else." Permission was granted for a supervised exchange. This time, the prisoners were allowed to prepare. Using materials from their work assignments and personal possessions, they created return gifts. The transformation of the camp during preparation was remarkable. Women who'd been listless found purpose. Skills hidden by imprisonment emerged. Artistic abilities, craftsmanship, creativity that military service had suppressed. Haruko created intricate paper flowers from newspaper and rice paste, dyeing them with vegetable juices from the kitchen. Each flower was unique, beautiful, and heartbreaking in its delicate hope. Yuki used her diary to practice English, writing a letter to the unknown woman who'd given it to her. Michiko organized a group to create a traditional Japanese banner using scraps of fabric, each woman contributing a piece, literally weaving their stories together. The February 14th exchange, deliberately chosen for Valentine's Day to emphasize love over war, created scenes that prison censors struggled to describe. Dorothy Williams received Haruko's paper flowers with tears streaming down her face. The former comfort woman and the Gold Star mother stood facing each other, neither speaking the other's language, both understanding perfectly. Dorothy pulled Haruko into an embrace that violated every military protocol and transcended every cultural barrier. "My son," Dorothy whispered, though Haruko couldn't understand the words, "would have wanted this." Through Mary Yamamoto's translation, stories began to flow. The Phoenix women learned about homes destroyed, families separated, the impossible choices war forced on everyone. The Japanese women learned about American rationing, factory work, the struggles of maintaining home front morale while losing children to distant battles. They discovered that suffering was universal, that enemy mothers cried the same tears. One exchange particularly resonated. Mrs. Sarah Henderson, whose family had sent the first card Yuki received, brought photographs of her 3 children. Her eldest, Tom, was somewhere in the Pacific. Through translation, she told Yuki, "I pray every night that some Japanese mother is showing kindness to Tom if he's captured, just as I'm trying to show kindness to you." Yuki responded through tears. "Henderson-san, if your son was in Japan prison, I would want my mother to give him gifts. But in Japan, this not possible. We taught Americans are demons. You teach us we are wrong. This harder than prison. Learning everything you believe is lie." The American women hadn't anticipated this aspect, that their kindness was actually causing pain by forcing the prisoners to confront the falseness of their propaganda. Dorothy Williams addressed this directly. "The truth often hurts before it heals. You've been lied to, just as we've been told lies about you. Every side in war creates demons of their enemies because it's easier to kill demons than humans." These exchanges led to an extraordinary development. Several Japanese women began requesting English lessons, not for intelligence purposes, but to better understand their gift givers. Mary Yamamoto found herself teaching English to eager students who wanted to read the Christmas cards without translation, to understand the American women's stories firsthand. Meanwhile, the American women faced their own challenges. Some congregation members accused them of treason. of dishonoring dead soldiers by comforting the enemy. The Phoenix newspaper ran a critical editorial asking if the churchwomen would be so generous if they'd seen Pearl Harbor firsthand, if they'd lost sons at Bataan. Dorothy Williams responded publicly, "I have seen Pearl Harbor in my nightmares every night for 3 years. I lost my son there, but I've learned that hate won't bring David back. These Japanese women didn't kill him. Fear and hatred between nations did. If I can reduce even a small amount of that hatred, David's death has meaning." The controversy reached military authorities, with some officers arguing the gift exchanges should cease. But an unexpected advocate emerged, Private Johnson, the guard whose life the Japanese nurses had helped save. He wrote to his congressman, describing how former enemies had worked together to save him. The letter was published in newspapers, shifting public opinion slightly towards sympathy. By March 1945, Camp Florence had become something unprecedented. Not quite a prison, not quite a community, but a space where enemies were learning to see each other as human. The Japanese women still lived behind barbed wire, still faced uncertain futures, still mourned their destroyed homeland. But they now possessed something that transcended imprisonment, proof that their enemies were capable of kindness, which meant they themselves were worthy of kindness. This revelation would prove more lasting than any military victory, more subversive than any propaganda. 76 women were discovering that everything they'd been taught about American demons was wrong, which meant everything else they'd been taught might be wrong too. And once that door of doubt opened, it could never be completely closed. The spring of 1945 brought wildflowers to the Arizona desert and devastating news from the Pacific. As March turned to April, reports filtered into Camp Florence that would test every fragile bridge built between captors and captives. The Battle of Okinawa had begun, with casualties mounting to horrific levels. American families in Phoenix received telegrams that began, "We regret to inform you," while Japanese prisoners heard nothing from home except silence. It was in this atmosphere of escalating loss that Michiko Tanaka made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. She approached Captain Morrison with a request, Mary Yamamoto translating her carefully prepared words. "Captain Morrison, we know American families receive bad news from war. We want to help. We have nursing skills. Some have experience with grieving families. Please, let us be useful." Morrison was stunned. Japanese prisoners were offering to comfort American families who'd lost sons fighting Japan. The proposal was so far outside military protocol that Morrison had no framework for responding. She promised to consider it, then spent sleepless nights wrestling with implications. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patricia Anderson, who'd recently received word that her nephew was missing in action over Japan, heard about the prisoner's offer. She arrived at Morrison's office with a simple statement. "Captain, those women know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe they can help us bear what we're losing too." A carefully controlled program was established. Japanese women with medical training would assist at the local military hospital, tending American wounded from the Pacific Theater. The first day, 5 volunteers, led by Michiko, were transported under guard to Phoenix Military Hospital. The scene that greeted them defied every expectation. American soldiers, some missing limbs, others blinded, lay in rows of beds. Many had fought Japanese forces days or weeks earlier. Now Japanese women approached to tend their wounds. The tension was explosive. One Marine sergeant, missing his left leg from Iwo Jima, screamed when he saw Michiko's face. "Get them away from me! Get those Jap—" But Michiko didn't retreat. She knelt beside his bed, below his eye level, making herself small and unthreatening. In careful English, she said, "I am nurse. I help Japanese soldiers who looked like you, young, hurt, afraid. Now I help you. War is there." She pointed toward the window, toward the Pacific. "Here is only healing." The sergeant stared at her, confusion replacing rage. Another wounded soldier in the adjacent bed spoke up. "Let her help, Tom. My mom wrote that Japanese women at that camp got Christmas gifts from Phoenix folks. Maybe they're different. Over the following weeks, a routine developed that no one could have predicted. Japanese nurses tended American wounded with the same dedication they'd shown Japanese soldiers. They learned American soldiers called for their mothers, just as Japanese soldiers had. They discovered that pain sounds the same in any language, that young men dying far from home all wear the same expression of bewildered loss. Haruko Nakamura, despite her traumatic past, proved especially gifted at comforting traumatized soldiers. She couldn't explain her experiences, but she understood damage that went deeper than physical wounds. She would sit silently beside soldiers with thousand-yard stares, her presence somehow communicating understanding without words. One soldier later wrote to his family that a Japanese woman had helped him more than any psychiatrist, simply by demonstrating that survival after horror was possible. But it was April 12th that brought the most shocking development. President Roosevelt died, and even in the prisoner compound the impact was felt. The Japanese women had been taught that Roosevelt was a demon, architect of their destruction. Yet they watched American guards cry openly, saw the genuine grief of their captors. Dorothy Williams arrived at the camp that day, not with gifts, but seeking comfort. Her son had died believing in Roosevelt's vision of a United Nations after war. Now that vision seemed to die too. In a moment that transcended every boundary, Yuki Sato approached Dorothy and, in carefully practiced English, said, "We know loss of leader. Emperor is God to us, but Roosevelt was father to you. We are sorry for your pain." This expression of sympathy from enemies for the death of their war leader created a psychological earthquake. American guards who'd maintained professional distance found themselves sharing cigarettes with prisoners. Conversations began, halting, translated, but real. Stories emerged from both sides that complicated every simple narrative of good versus evil. Private Reynolds, a guard from Texas, told Michiko about finding dead Japanese soldiers on Saipan with photographs of children in their pockets, just like American soldiers carried. Michiko told Reynolds about treating American prisoners in a field hospital before Saipan fell, how she'd risked punishment to share her water ration with a wounded Marine. These exchanges might have remained isolated incidents, but Mary Yamamoto began recording them, sensing their historical importance. Her notes, discovered decades later, provide intimate glimpses into humanity asserting itself despite war's machinery. Then came May 8th, VE Day, Germany's surrender. The camp erupted in celebration among American personnel, but the Japanese women watched with complex emotions. Germany had been their ally. Its defeat meant Japan stood alone. Yet they'd also learned enough about Nazi atrocities to question what kind of ally Germany had been. When American guards shared chocolate and cigarettes in celebration, several Japanese women accepted, a tacit acknowledgement that some victories deserved celebration regardless of sides. It was during this period that the women began their most ambitious project. Using materials salvaged and donated, they created a massive banner, part American flag, part Japanese rising sun, with a white dove bridging both. Embroidered in both languages were words, "Mother's tears are the same in every nation." They presented it to Dorothy Williams and the Phoenix Church women at a ceremony that no military manual could have scripted. Dorothy's response, preserved in a letter to her sister, captures the moment. "These women who we were taught to hate have shown us that hate is learned, which means it can be unlearned. They've lost everything, homes, families, nation, yet they create beauty and offer comfort. If enemies can become healers, what excuse do we have for continued hatred?" But the most profound moment came in late May, when news arrived that would test every bridge built between enemies. The firebombing of Tokyo on May 25, 26, had killed over 100,000 civilians. The Japanese women learned their capital was burning, their families likely dead. The Americans who'd shown them kindness were the same Americans dropping incendiary bombs on their homes. The camp fell into stunned silence. Haruko was found that night standing at the barbed wire, staring west toward a Japan that might no longer exist. Dorothy Williams, learning of the devastation, came to the camp unbidden. She found Haruko and stood beside her in silence. Finally, Haruko spoke in broken English she'd been learning. "Your people burn my city. My family may be dead, but you give me Christmas gift. You hold me when I cry. I don't understand. War, kindness, how both exist." Dorothy's answer, translated by Mary Yamamoto for all the gathered women to hear, would be remembered by everyone present. "I don't understand either. I think war happens when we see nations and forget people. Kindness happens when we see people and forget nations. Tonight, I don't see Japan. I see women who've lost what I would lose if Phoenix burned. Your tears are not enemy tears. They're just tears." That night, American guards reported sounds from the prisoner compound they'd never heard before. Japanese women singing American hymns they'd learned from the church visitors, mixed with Japanese lamentations for their burning homeland. It was a sound that belonged to no nation, no side, no ideology, just humans mourning together what humans had done to each other. The war was entering its final phase, but at Camp Florence, something beyond war was being born. The recognition that enemies were constructs, that kindness could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, that women separated by everything could be united by understanding that their losses were the same loss, their tears the same tears, their hopes for their children the same hopes that transcended flags and borders and the bitter mathematics of war. August arrived in Arizona with devastating news that would end the war and forever change the world. On August 6th, Hiroshima disappeared in atomic fire. On August 9th, Nagasaki followed. At Camp Florence, American personnel struggled to comprehend the magnitude of destruction, while Japanese women collapsed under the weight of unimaginable loss. Michiko Tanaka's sister lived in Hiroshima. Yuki Sato's parents were in Nagasaki. In an instant, their worlds potentially evaporated. The American guards, who'd grown to know these women as individuals, found themselves representatives of the nation that had unleashed this horror. The careful bridges built over months threatened to collapse in seconds. Captain Morrison made a decision that violated protocol but honored humanity. She allowed the Japanese women to hold a memorial service for the atomic bomb victims. American guards stood at respectful attention as enemies mourned their dead. Dorothy Williams and several Phoenix church women attended uninvited but welcomed, sitting among Japanese prisoners as they chanted Buddhist prayers for souls they'd never know if they were mourning. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through a radio Morrison had specially arranged. The Japanese women heard their god emperor announce surrender, his human voice destroying the last mythology of their world. Many had never heard him speak before. Tradition held that divine voices would strike mortals dead. Yet they lived, listening to defeat delivered in formal Japanese that some younger women barely understood. The war was over, but what came next was unclear. The women were no longer enemies, but remained prisoners. Repatriation would come, but to what? Their cities were ash, their families likely dead, their nation occupied by the same Americans who'd shown them Christmas kindness and atomic annihilation. In September, an extraordinary meeting occurred. General Jonathan Wainwright, hero of Bataan and recently freed from Japanese prison camps where he'd endured years of torture, visited Camp Florence. His presence created impossible tension. Here was an American general who had every reason to hate Japanese captors, meeting Japanese women who'd been part of the military system that tortured him. The meeting, arranged by Morrison, who believed in confronting rather than avoiding difficult truths, took place in the mess hall. Wainwright entered, gaunt from years of starvation, wearing a uniform that hung loose on his skeletal frame. The Japanese women stood and bowed deeply. Not military protocol, but genuine respect for suffering endured. Through Mary Yamamoto, Wainwright spoke. I spent 3 years in Japanese camps where cruelty was policy. I watched friends die from torture, disease, deliberate starvation. I have every reason to hate you." He paused, looking at the assembled women. "But I've learned something. The guards who tortured us were following orders from men who never saw our faces. You are not those men. You are not those guards. You are individuals who've shown Americans kindness when you had every reason for hatred. If you can forgive atomic bombs, perhaps I can forgive prison camps." Michiko stood and responded in English she'd perfected over months. "General San, we cannot apologize enough for what Japanese military did. We were part of a system that created suffering. But American women taught us that people are not their governments, that kindness can exist between enemies. We are not worthy of your forgiveness, but we are grateful for your words." Wainwright's response stunned everyone. "You've treated American wounded with compassion. You've comforted grieving families. You've proven that Japanese people are not the monsters we were taught to see. Perhaps that's the best apology, living proof that we were all wrong about each other." October brought repatriation orders. The women would return to Japan on a military transport ship, arriving in a homeland under American occupation. Their feelings were complex beyond expression. Joy at going home, terror at what they'd find, sadness at leaving Americans who'd become friends, uncertainty about their place in a defeated nation. The Phoenix Church women organized a farewell gathering that violated every expectation of how victors treat vanquished. Instead of celebrating enemy departure, they mourned friend separation. Gifts were exchanged, not charity for prisoners, but mementos between people who'd found unexpected connection. Dorothy Williams gave Haruko a photograph of her son David, the sailor who died at Pearl Harbor. "Take this to Japan," she said through tears. "Let people know that an American mother forgave Japanese women, that David's death led not to hatred, but to understanding. Maybe that knowledge will help healing begin." Haruko reciprocated with the only valuable item she possessed, a silk scarf that had survived from before her time in comfort stations, embroidered by her mother with symbols of protection. "For your protection," she managed in English. "My mother made for me, but didn't protect. Maybe protects you better." The most powerful moment came when Private Johnson, the guard whose life the Japanese nurses had helped save, organized his fellow guards to create a send-off that no one expected. As the women boarded buses for the ship, American soldiers stood in formation and saluted, not mockingly, but genuinely, acknowledging not enemies but women who'd maintained dignity through imprisonment and shown healing despite horror. The journey home took 3 weeks. The women arrived in Yokohama Harbor to find their worst fears realized. Japan was devastated beyond imagination. Cities were rubble, civilians were starving, occupation forces were everywhere. But they also arrived with something unique, personal connections to Americans that complicated every simple narrative of victor and vanquished. The immediate aftermath was difficult. Some women were shunned for having been prisoners, seen as shameful survivors who should have chosen death. Others were suspected of collaboration for speaking positively about American treatment. But slowly their stories began to matter. Michiko found work as a translator for occupation forces, using skills learned at Camp Florence. Her supervisor was stunned when she mentioned Dorothy Williams, whom he'd read about in American newspapers. The story of Phoenix women giving Christmas gifts to Japanese prisoners became legend among occupation personnel, proof that reconciliation was possible. Yuki's diary, filled with English practice and reflections on American kindness, became a secret testament she shared with select friends. Her entries about Gold Star mothers giving gifts to enemies challenged Japanese assumptions about American barbarity. "If they could be kind during war," she wrote, "perhaps they'll be just during peace." Haruko's journey was most remarkable. Despite trauma that should have destroyed her, she founded a small organization to help other comfort women recover. Using techniques learned from comforting American soldiers, that shared pain creates connection. She built networks of support that government and society ignored. Dorothy Williams's photograph of her son remained on Haruko's desk, a reminder that forgiveness was possible even for the unforgivable. In 1975, 30 years after war's end, a reunion was organized. 5 Japanese women returned to Arizona, meeting the American women who'd changed their lives. The gathering was small, unnoticed by media focused on Cold War tensions, but for those present it was profound vindication that kindness during conflict created bonds that outlasted hatred. Dorothy Williams, now elderly, embraced Haruko with strength that belied her age. "You survived," she whispered. "We both survived. That's victory enough." Michiko, now a successful interpreter who'd helped facilitate numerous Japanese-American business partnerships, spoke at the reunion. "You gave us gifts when we were enemies, but real gift was showing us that enemy is temporary word, that human is permanent condition. Every translation I make, every bridge I build between our nations exists because you showed me bridges were possible." The documentary evidence of Camp Florence's experiment in humanity remains scattered through archives, letters, and memories. Military historians focus on battles and strategies, rarely noting that 76 Japanese women and handful of American church ladies proved that war's first casualty isn't truth, but the ability to see enemies as human. Yet their legacy persists in ways both subtle and profound. Every Japanese tourist welcomed in Phoenix, every American teaching English in Tokyo, every partnership between former enemies carries echo of Christmas gifts given in desert prison camp. These women proved that kindness is not weakness, but courage, that mercy is not surrender, but victory over war's true enemy, the hatred that makes killing possible. Today, Camp Florence is largely forgotten, its buildings demolished, its records buried in archives. But sometimes when desert wind blows through Phoenix, it carries whisper of Buddhist chants mixed with Christian hymns, of Japanese women singing American songs while American women learned origami, of enemies becoming friends through simple recognition that suffering is universal, joy is shareable, and kindness is the only weapon that wins by refusing to fight. The war ended with atomic bombs and emperors' surrender. But for 76 women and their American friends, it ended differently, with embraces at a train station, promises to write, and profound understanding that they'd discovered something more powerful than victory or defeat, the indestructible capacity for humans to recognize humanity in each other, even when everything in their world demanded they see only enemies.